I'm here with Tom Campbell today. It's nice to be talking to you again, Tom.
Thank you, Donna. It's good to be here.
I'd like to concentrate on your virtual reality theme. Reality is information. I'd like to take it a little bit further out and see just how far my big toe applies. When we went out to London twice, we visited many of Britain's famous historic places.
Mm-hmm.
We also went to France. And in between the workshop activities, you notice layers of time. You can extract information from places and from historic places and museums and such things as that. And that's simply an example of and a verification of your idea of this is an informational reality. So, and it's all accessible to us. Could you extend a little bit on how you can access the information from these places? And this is, of course, just one example of the kind of information you can access. So I thought it might be an interesting one to those historians and those people who often wonder about the events and places such as Stonehenge. We visited the Ashmolean Museum, and for those places to be accessed for information that's outside of this reality in many layers of time, is that something that you can tell our listeners how to do this, how to access this information?
Sure. We do live in a reality frame that is virtual and is informational. And we are not alone, as you know, there are other reality frames as well. All of the data that we talk about history. History is all of the information about what has happened. Okay, well, all of this history is recorded, if you will, and when you're in an informational reality, and I make a metaphor of using like the World of Warcraft or the Sims game. You know, that's an informational reality. It's data. It's ones and zeros in a computer someplace that is producing the Sims. So that's an informational reality. Ours is similar, and just like the Sims computer, the mainframe that serves the Sims up to the millions of users that might be using it at any particular time, that server could, if it wished, keep track of everything that happened, of every move, of every character, of every detail. It's all there in the server. The server's putting that out, and if it wanted to, it could save all that information. Now, I doubt that the Sims people do save all that information because it probably doesn't serve much of a use for them to play back all of the gameplay that was going on their server. But it could be done. Now, in this virtual reality, and for the listeners out there, if you want to know more about this reality as a virtual reality and this reality as data and information, I'm not going to derive that here. We're just assuming that you've already, listened to some of the other things that have explained how that comes about. Particularly, if you're new to my work, go to the YouTube site. TWCJR44 is the name of the site. Go to that site and look at the Calgary video, all day Saturday, all day Sunday. Actually, you can do Friday too if you'd like to start with an introduction. So that's a good place to look to find out about the science and the logic behind calling this an information-based virtual reality. So we'll just start here, assuming that you understand that and that it is. So if you have an information-based reality that can keep the data, if there's good reason for it, it will keep the data. And in this case, there's very good reason for it because we learn from history. And history is an important part of the present, where we've come from, what we've done, what's happened and how did we get here. That's all an important part of your sense of who you are, how you got to be here, and most importantly, it's part of the learning process. It's hard to learn and grow and become different if you have no concept of what you are and what you have been. So the history is a valuable part of this. And because this is a learning lab, a schoolhouse, if you will, that's our virtual reality, the larger conscious system that has constructed this virtual reality for us would like to make sure that its virtual reality is optimum. And for that, it needs to keep track of what happened and why it happened and what's going on, because then it can make adjustments in the process of giving us this virtual reality, just like the Sims people keep track of gameplay, I'm sure, so that they can improve the game, make the game better, and see where the sticking points are and where the frustration is, and see if they can't improve the gaming experience. Well, larger conscious systems doing the same thing. So there is a reason for it to keep all that data. So I have explained, and you'll see it on the Calgary film, that there are several databases, I call them. And it's really just one big database, but we break it up into pieces because it's easier to talk about that way. There's the future probable reality, which is everything that could happen and the probability that it would happen. And then there is our history thread, what it is that we actually do in the present moment, which is where all the free will gets exerted, and that's where the history gets generated, in the present moments where we act in this. It's the moment of this virtual reality where we're all players. And then there's the all the things we could have done but didn't. So that's all the rest of the potential probable history. That's just a reflection of that probable future after time has passed it through the present into the past. So we have everything that could have happened but didn't, everything that we did do, everything that did happen, and then there's the probable future. So that's kind of and the present is between those future and past databases is where all the action happens. That's where the history's written. Okay, so that's the theory, and go find that in the Calgary video if you would like to see a more scientific derivation of it. So yes, when you go to a place like Stonehenge, or even if somebody hands you a bauble or a piece of jewelry or something that's very old, it doesn't even have to be very old. It doesn't matter. You can use your intent to query the database. You can use your intent to change the probabilities in the future probability database. These are all things we talk about in Calgary. So when you want to kind of query the database to see what it is that's associated with a particular object, and it may be old, it may be an old ruin someplace, like you were talking, we visited some old castles and some old ruins and some stones that were sticking up out of the ground, much like Stonehenge, except they were in a different part of, they were in the Cotswold area rather than Stonehenge. There's a lot of information that you get, but it's not that the information is stored, stay in the stones or in that piece of jewelry. The information is in these databases, and you're just querying this database to get information about that thing. What was going on? What was happening around the time that thing was built, say, or manufactured, or who owned it? And most things have layers of information. You start out with looking at something, and maybe you go back, maybe 100,000 years, prehistory, and you can see what's going on there. And then you can move up to only 10,000 years, and then maybe only 5,000 years, and then maybe 2,000 years. And you can move the time scale up as you're pulling out the data for those various time periods, and you can see how things change, how that land was used differently, how a certain thing, came to be. But a caution, it's not like you're reading a history book, in a sense. You're getting data. And as always, you have to interpret that data. And how you interpret the data has a lot to do with how much you know already. In other words, if we were now just to look in what would be a culture that would be very foreign to us. Let's say we were going to look into a group of Aborigines, pygmies in the Amazon. Okay, now that's a culture we know very little about. None of us really knows, what pygmies that live in the Amazon do all day, at work. What's their life like? Well, we don't know. So if we looked into that and we saw one group coming this way and another group coming out of the jungle that way, and they're walking over and they're doing something, how would we interpret what they were doing, you see? Well, we wouldn't know. So we'd say, well, there's just a bunch of people milling around, would maybe be our interpretation. Whereas it's somebody that knew something about those people and that culture might be able to tell you that they were right in the middle of some very important thing that was going on, you see, but we would miss all that. We wouldn't know. So we just say, well, nothing really going on there, just people milling about. You see, so you get data, but then you have to interpret it. Your interpretation is based on your own information, your fears, your beliefs, you know, what you care about, what you don't, just whatever it is that makes you up, your emotional, spiritual, you know, mental, physical state has to interpret this data. So it's what you get is going to be personal. How you interpret it is going to be personal. You should find similarities in it. If two people from the same culture both looked at the same data, they probably get similar interpretations. But it's not like reading a history that somebody's prepared for you. So if you pick up a history book and you read it, it's not just the way it was. It's not that you're just looking in at history at that time. You're getting an interpretation of the historian who wrote the book. He's telling you why those people are coming out of the jungle at that place and what the context is from, you know, their history from before that till after that, and how does this what's going on now fit into a larger picture. And you get all of that from the mind of the historian, which of course is his personal view of that time. So that's what you'll get from history. Here, all you get is the data. Nobody's telling you the context. So there's a kind of an art in getting that data, trying not to overlay too much of your own interpretation on it, and then just kind of accepting it as it comes. And you don't really know a lot of times why it's like that or the significance of it.
I think that's really interesting. When you say you're going to explain from your scientific viewpoint how to access the data, and I know that's a highly focused intent, but people will expect to see things, feel things, hear things. There's many ways that an individual can access the data. It might be just like a transparent photograph, like a movie. It could be feelings. It could be simply something intuitive. There are, as you have said before, many ways that you can receive this data. Could you go into more detail of that?
Sure. We're all individual. Those of us who are very left brain and intellectual will probably get the data in a sequence of events with causality. Oh, this happened, then that happened. That, we'll see it like that, like a series of events. Those of us that are more right-brained will get the feel of it. We'll get the sense of it, what's going on. And those of us that are not visual but auditory, we may get a sense of the soundscape. So it depends on the individual. The way you interpret the data has to do with the way you interpret your world the same way. Different people see the same thing, and you'll get different interpretations of what happened and what was going on and why it was significant. So we all will pick up something different based on us being different. So that's that is an important idea.
Can you give us an example of how an archaeologist or a historian, a museum curator, could use the information from My Big Toe, the idea of reality as a virtual reality, as an information database? I can see where this would be helpful to those people, as well as people in many other fields. Can you give us some practical advice about how they might access this?
Sure. The key to doing this is to let your let your ego and your fears and everything else that you probably define as yourself go. You have to just open yourself to the information with no expectations. And most people will get something if they do that. If they just kind of open their minds, and then they have to have an intent of what it is they want to see. Now, there's a lot of issues here that make it difficult. Okay, even though it's not really a difficult thing to do, it's an easy thing to get in the way and to mess up. It's not hard to do it, but it's easy to cloud the result. So one of the things that is important is that your intent has to be clear. If you have an intent that says, I'd just like to see what was going on at this site back when the stones were being put into place, or back when this piece of jewelry was made, and then you just will see just that. Now, if your intent is just to see it right around that place, or maybe the process of the jewelry being made, then that's all you'll see. You'll see maybe an oven where the jewelry was being bent or heated, where the metal was being twisted, where the stone was being put in. You might just see that, and that's all you see. So you may just see a picture of a couple of hands, a glowing fire, and some things going on. Very non-specific. It's not like you're backing up to a big picture of what the times were like, and what the person was making it was like, and what was his life. You didn't ask any of that. You see, all you asked is a very specific question. That's all the data you will get. So first of all, you have to realize that you're querying a database. If you query it with a very specific request, you get a very specific result. If you query it with a very general query, you'll get tons and tons of stuff that might fit that query, but it may not be what you want. So that's kind of a catch-22 where you are. You're very, very specific. You'd like to see kind of more of the borders around that. You have to explore it. You can't just get it all necessarily easy in one look. So the first thing is you have to get good at querying. So you look at a specific thing, and then you maybe query the database a little more. Okay, here's that piece of jewelry being made. Here's that rock being put into place. Now, who was it that put that in? Let me see something of the individual that is working on that jewelry, or just put that rock in place. Or let me see an idea of the group of individuals, the society, the culture that's doing this. Suddenly you'll get different data. Now, can you interpret what a culture's doing? If you see, a culture, if we looked at the culture and again in some Amazonian jungle, could we make sense of it? Would we understand it? What if we looked into some small village in China someplace? Would we understand what was going on there? So you have these problems. You're going to get information, but you have to interpret it, and you have to lead the query. Usually there's a whole series of queries, you see, as you broaden your scope. So it's not just a matter of, I'd like to know about that. You see, that's a very general. Know about what? What in particular? You're querying a database. You see, you can't just say, I'd like to know about what was going on then. What do you mean, going on? You see, how general is going on? Well, if you say those sorts of things with your intent, you'll just get, it's like my example often is, it's like going to Google and typing in the word love. You'll get 6 million replies, and most of them will be of no value to you. It's the same thing if your intent is, I'd like to see what was going on there, because going on there just is too general a sense. So you need to be specific. Then your intent needs to be like an investigator. You need to explore. Well, I've seen a little bit here. Tell me more about that. Tell me more about this. Who did that, and why were they doing this? And if you ask why were they doing this, you may not get a picture. Often you don't get pictures of why is this being done. Now you'll just get information. It won't be text, but it'll just be downloaded information. All things that you ask for aren't necessarily good for to be given to you in pictures. So it's a mixed media, if you will, and you have to be able to be open to all of that. Now, so that's one thing. It's just the querying itself is an art that you have to practice and get good at so you can be specific enough to get valuable data, but yet then generalize those specifics slowly as you explore that environment. So there is some art to querying the database. So that's one thing. It's not just necessarily a trivial thing to do. It takes experience. You have to work at this. Now the second thing is, if you just do this out of the clear blue sky, if you say, oh, I'm an archaeologist, I'd like to, you'll get some data back, and the next thing you'll say is, well, did I just make that up? I can't rely on that. There's no credibility there, right? Okay, I did get this scene, and I could see stuff that was going on, and perhaps that's plausible, but maybe this is coming out of my own head of what I imagine it might be like. That's not objective history. I can't rely on that. I can't write papers based on that sort of thing. Well, that's probably true. I wouldn't argue with those statements at all. So the second thing that takes time is that you have to develop the skill slowly and corroborate it with facts. You have to develop your ability to access data from these databases and check the data that you get against facts that you know from another source, which means you're going to spend some years learning to access data that you can then check on. What happened 10,000 years ago, you can't check on. There aren't any records from 10,000 years ago. That is impossible to check, but you can do things that happened 5 years ago, or that happened yesterday, or that happened today at some place that you are not. Now we're in a place that's called remote viewing. Well, remote viewing is nothing more than accessing the database. It's just another way of accessing the database. Let me see what such and such coordinates, what's going on at that place, or I'd like to see what's happening, in my parents' house at, this morning, that kind of thing. Well, it's just getting data out of the database. All that's in the database. So it's just queries, and it's usually specific queries. So remote viewing and collecting data out of the database are a very similar thing. Oh, I'd like to see whether or not somebody is ill or healthy or what's wrong with them physically. It's just getting data out of the database. All of these things are just different kinds of queries. I'd like to see, the person who originally bought this ring or had this ring made for them, or the stones that get put up in the Stonehenge. I'd like to see the process of the stones being put in, this sort of thing. Then it's all just data from the database. But if you start with meditation, because you cannot get clear data back unless you have a clear, open mind and a clear intent. Most of us don't have clear, open minds. And those are two different things, clear and open. One, it has to be open enough that you just let the information in without operating on it, without judging it, without making it make sense to you. Because when you put this filter on it, says, well, this data didn't make sense, so I'll kind of rearrange it a little way to make it make sense, then you are meddling with the data. And it's not data anymore. Now it's your expectations are changing the data. So first you have to be able to achieve a mental state where you have no expectations, where you have no fear, where you have no ego. You have to transcend all of that. And having no ego is very problematic for most people because they're full of ego. Ego is how they operate in this world. It's just normal for people to have lots of fear and lots of ego. So now we have a front end problem that you have to get rid of this ego, fear, get to a state where your mind is clear of all those things and open. And that takes a lot of practice. Okay. Then, once you do that, second step is to practice evidential things with things that you can check on until you understand just exactly how you do it and how does it work and how clear does the state have to be and how open and how do you get the data and how do you translate it so that it's right, so that you can get evidence, you can see things that you can check on. And once you do that, you build up confidence. You say, oh, every time I do it this way, and now that I've reached this level of my development where I've got my ego down and I can get this clear mind, if I do it this way, then I get the right answers. Well, with experience, you gain confidence that when you do that, you get right data. You are accessing data and you're accessing it, accurately. Now, when you access something that's 100,000 years old, where there's not going to be any written records, obviously. It's now archaeologists guessing from the little bit of clues that they dig up out of the ground. And an archaeologist, if you'd like to see more of it, if you've done all these other steps, you can do that and get that information. Being the archaeologist, what you see will mean more to you. And if you have developed confidence and trust in your results through experimentation, then you can rely on that data and say, yeah, I'm getting this information and I trust it. But the trust has to be built up. If you just one day say, well, I'll try that. Oh yeah, I see this, but there's no trust. And there shouldn't be any trust. You haven't yet learned to have focused intent, to have no expectations, to get your own mind and thoughts and fears and stuff out of the way. There's a lot of processing you haven't learned yet. So it probably is just out of your imagination until you learn for it not to be. So in a way, you see, it sounds like it's very difficult. Well, it's not so difficult. All these things that I've been telling about that you have to do is learning how to stop messing it up, how to stop interfering with it. So it's getting rid of the fear. It's getting rid of things. It's not like, well, you have to learn this special new way of doing things. Here's the recipe that you can do this. That's not it. You have to change yourself. And that's the hard part of the process, is to get rid of all the things that block your ability to do it, because you're consciousness. As consciousness, you have an ability to query these databases, to get this information anytime you want, any way you want, and it's an open system. So it's like you have all the, doing it is easy. Getting rid of all the things that keep you from doing it, all of these things we've just been talking about, lack of experience, fear, beliefs, all this stuff, getting rid of all that junk, that's the hard part. So that's why I say, it's really an easy thing to do, but, you have to prepare yourself to be able to do it. Then you have to experiment so that you build up confidence in that you're doing it well and that your answers are good, and then you're ready to make some use of it as an archaeologist or some other profession. So that's kind of it's very easy to do, but it's very hard to get yourself ready to where it's easy to do.
I think this is a very good point. I'm glad you brought back the fact that as consciousness we have the natural innate ability to do this. This isn't a gift for just some. It is, certain people do have more gifts, but I think this might be a good place to bring in the double slit experiment, because in some of the workshops I've heard a comment, well, what does this double slit experiment mean to me? This is physics. I don't think this is going to be of any interest or importance to me or relevance to me. But when you present that, as we did at the Unity presentation in Atlanta, it's very important for people to get that, because knowing the significance of the double slit experiment shows us that this reality is not objective. It is subjective, and it therefore points to consciousness as the means by which you interpret a reality subjectively. And this information that you tap into is can be a result of that. It's disciplined. You need, as you say, the scientific protocol in order to improve on that. But it is accessible to everyone with the work. You have said that mysticism, will be the new science. This isn't out there mysticism. This is science. This is something that, if they understand the double slit experiment, then everything falls into place. This is why I brought out the subject that seems as though it's just a mystical experience. I have a friend who went into the Lascaux caves in France, and he was so so moved by the paintings that he saw. This was many years back when you could see the actual paintings. So moved and had such a focused intent, he wanted to know who would have painted this. Who is the person who painted this? And there it was, right in front of him. There was a man. He could see the color of the skin and the things that he was wearing, and there was the person that was painting. Mm-hmm. And this is an ordinary person who, previous to this, didn't have any kind of experience like that. It was simply that this particular thing was so important to him that he left everything. He let everything go.
He was able to focus his intent.
He was able to focus it very clearly. Mm-hmm. So what you're describing, I want to make the point, is very accessible to everyone, and in many different fields. I think we're going to carry on with other subjects in the same idea or the same theme, such as music and art and writing. I'd like to know what your ideas are about that and how it can apply to everyone, whatever their interest or their profession is, how it can be of help to them.
Okay. When you mentioned mysticism, I think what I was saying was that what is mystical is relative. It depends on the person asking the question. If we had some of those indigenous pygmies out of the Amazon and presented them with a computer or a color television, they may find that very mystical. From their point of view, that would be, a very mystical box with people in it talking, and people weren't really there. It would be a mystical experience. Well, it's not really mystical to us because we understand how to build those kinds of things. We understand the science behind it. But what is mystical has to do with the perception of the asker. And many of the things that today, in the year 2012, what seemed to be mystical may well be science at another time. And it's always been that way through history. Most of the things that were spirits and gods and whatever that, did this or do that, the weather, right? That was all about, what the spirits and the gods were doing. And, Zeus with his lightning bolts and so on. Well, now we find out that, there's patterns to it and there's reasons for it doing what it does and how it does it. So things that we think are mystical turn out, and things that we think are kind of useless home remedies sometimes turn out to be actual very good medicine once we understand how they work. That's true too. So the things that we don't know, that most of us blow off as nonsense, may one day turn up as science. And that was the kind of the context of what I was saying there, is that what we call the paranormal, what we call getting this information out of the database, what we call how can you heal with your mind, the placebo effect. These things are all mystical, even though placebo effect is a part of our science. We have the double slit experiment. That's mystical. Scientists don't know why that works, you see. Well, traditional scientists don't know we know why that works, but they don't. The entanglement is another physics problem that's mystical. If somebody tries to explain how these two things on opposite ends of the universe instantaneously change, one changes when you change the other, well, we can't explain that objectively. And things that you cannot explain objectively are called paranormal, means beyond normal. And in our world, objective is normal. We live in an objective reality, and that's our normal reality. So things like the placebo effect and the double slit experiment and the entanglement of spin pairs, then these things are not objective, and therefore they're paranormal. Well, so are precognitive dreams, So are, your friend's experience at the cave, at seeing that person doing the painting. And we don't pay much attention to those things because they're not objective. But yet, with care, as I've just explained, and with practice, and with learning to do this in a way that you build confidence that what you're getting is the right information because you're going about it in the right way, then it's as solid information as any other information that you might get. It's not mystical anymore. It wasn't a mystical experience, but it was just somebody withdrawing data from a database. No more than Googling something is a mystical experience, right? It's the same sort of thing. You can go into Google and Google something, and out comes a bunch of data, some of which might be useful, and that's not a mystical experience. We understand that. Well, this is the same way. We live in a virtual reality. It's based on information. The information's in the database, and you can access it. There's no mysticism involved. It just appears that way to people who don't understand the nature of reality, who have never gotten rid of their fear and ego and arrogance and that sort of thing, which blocks all this stuff. They've never practiced and experimented and explored until they got good at doing this and getting right answers. And then, you see, so it seems mystical to somebody who's not prepared to understand it in a more fundamental way. So there's a lot that we see as mystical, that it's just our ignorance that makes it mystical to us. And we tend to put down people who understand things that we don't, because we figure if we don't understand it, then nobody could. So if we don't understand it, then we figure everybody who thinks that way must be foolish. It's just a kind of a typical arrogance and ego position that most of us take.
Well, we started off this interview with an example of accessing information from historic places, and you gave some examples, and they're far in the past. For instance, Hampton Court Palace. That's some place we visited. Is there a difference between a place that is relatively recent history but a lot of activity? Is it easier, or is it more difficult to pick up information from a place such as that?
Well, that's a good question, and there's several aspects to answer that question. One is, every detail is not in the database. I'm talking about this database, but just like every sentence spoken is not on Google, every detail about every subject is not available because it hasn't been collected. Well, that's the same way with this database. Every detail of everything since the beginning of time is not necessarily been collected. What the database collects and keeps are those things that it thinks are significant to the purpose of the virtual reality, which is growth. And it's significant in the sense, as we said in the beginning, that growth and learning are facilitated by understanding history, where we come from. So data has been kept, but not just every piece of data. So here we are, and as I sit here, I move my hand from this position to this position to that position. Well, if you look at this from the database, is that going to be in there? The fact that I moved my hand from here to here and back while I was talking. No, that data is not going to be collected. You see, it's not important. You just see somebody sitting here. And it wouldn't matter whether my hand was this way or that way or that way. It's irrelevant. So those kinds of things are not collected. So we're not talking about every bit of information that ever existed, and it's all there, and we're talking about selective information. So the further back you go, the less pertinent the detail is, in a sense. You get more from the past, from the long past, you get bigger pictures. It's the reasons why things did the way they did. It's not, did this individual scratch his head with his right hand or his left hand? You see, it isn't important. It's not this individual, but what did these, mobs of critters do? What was the state of humanity? How were they, it's the big picture questions you get, and that's the kind of intent that you would have, and that's the kind of data you would get. And if you go back there looking for the minutia, you may not find it. if it's not really significant as far as the history goes. So that's one thing. The database is not a perfect database of every bit that's ever happened. And how does the system decide what bits to let go? Well, obviously it's a real system, so the system has limitations to its capability, and it has a purpose, which is the evolution of consciousness. And between its limitations and its purpose, it decides what's more valuable and what's less valuable, just like we do on our computers. We decide what we save and what we delete. How useful is this going to be in the future, and how much space do I have just to save stuff in case? And then we make decisions and we let stuff go that we think isn't going to be particularly useful for us in the future. So it's done the same. It's the same kind of thing. So that's one aspect of differences. Secondly, we know more about the near past than we do about the ancient past because we have more information on it. We can make an intent that's a lot more specific. That's a place you mentioned was a specific place, and it is in our history. We do know something about it. So there we can start to refine our intent to something specific. When you're talking about something 100,000 years ago, there's a big dark spot there as far as what are you going to ask for highly specifically there that's going to really make a lot of sense. In other words, we're limited in our ability to ask good specific questions about things that are too far back. We can only ask big general questions because that's all the information we have to go by. Now, like any other database, you can't say, well, let's go back 100,000 years and just show me what was there. You see, show me what was there is not a specific query to a database. You may get all sorts of things, and you may not get it all. Show me what was there, you may see a rock sitting on the ground. That's it. Okay, now how useful is that? You say, show me what is there. So if you go to Google and say, okay, Google, tell me what you got. What do you get out of Google? Well, Google has this little thing that says, I'm feeling lucky, right? That's what you get. If you ever press the feeling lucky button, that's what you'll get. Who knows? And then, that may or may not be very useful to you. You're querying a database. You're not asking a professor who has studied this and knows the answers. You see, if you say, well, Professor Smith, what happened, at this place? Well, Professor Smith, who studied it, has come to his own personal opinions from his data, and he'll give you those. If you ask Google its personal opinion on something, you won't get anything back. It doesn't do that. It's a database. You see, it's not like Ask Mr. Science or Ask Mr. Professor. It's not that kind of a thing. This database is just a database. You have to query it. You have to get the data. And it's a very clever database, but it isn't going to guess what you think you might want and try to give you that. You have to ask for it, and you have to be specific. So that's the thing to understand. It's not like you're asking Mr. Science, and somehow Mr. Science lives up in the cloud of consciousness somewhere, and Mr. Science will go back and explain it all to you. It's generally not like that. You're just accessing the database. Now you can sometimes get other units of consciousness who know more than you do and have more experience to explain some things to you. That sometimes works. But if you're just yourself querying a database, you're limited into the context in which you get the information. So Google doesn't know the context in which to give you the information. Oh, I Googled love, and I was thinking about lovebirds. You see, that's what I was interested in. Well, that's a specific species of finch, right? They're called lovebirds. Well, Google doesn't know the context that you have if you don't tell it exactly in your query. Same way. Otherwise, you're relying on some other entity to their own personal interpretation of that, whether that's Professor Jones, right, who studied it, or whether that's some non-physical entity who had studied it or is making it up or whatever, you don't know. So whenever you get somebody else to give you the answer, you have to understand you're getting their answer filtered through their experience for their reasons. And that's a little risky. And again, like anything else, if you had a lot of conversations with Professor Jones and you really think he knows what he's doing, and you think his scholarship is sound, then you put a lot of trust in it. But if Professor Jones is somebody that you met in an internet cafe, and he says, "Oh, I'm Professor Jones, and I know all about this," in those times there were three-headed green monsters and da-da-da-da-da-da. Well, maybe not, you see. It's the same way with non-physical entities. You have all kinds, and some of them know what they're talking about, some of them are making it up, some of them are having fun. You have to build trust. You can't build trust on a first meeting, whether it's Mr. Jones or whether it's some other non-physical being. That takes time. And the only way you build trust is if you get information that makes sense to you. So now we're back to exploring a relationship to develop trust. Just like you're exploring your ability to do good database searches. Again, we're back to the hard part. It takes time to develop these sorts of trusts and skills and confidence.
You've illustrated that very well. This is the nature of reality. This is how we evolve. It has to be by individual, personal.
Right. This reality is, in a way, it is about us. What our purpose here is to evolve the quality of our consciousness, to evolve our being, and that's a personal thing. Nobody can do that for us. And that's what we're doing. Now, we're in a multiplayer game with a lot of other people who are supposed to be doing the same thing. But they have to evolve themselves. You have to evolve yourself.
Exactly.
So in a way, this is it's just like the World of Warcraft. Your characters in there, a lot of other characters, and they all are kind of going about it in their own way. And you have your own missions and your own things you're supposed to do and information you're supposed to collect, and so do they. But you interact, and sometimes you help each other, sometimes you hurt each other. But it's about your character, you're playing in the game, and how you're going to help this character evolve the quality of his consciousness.
Well, the people who are on this path of evolving positively, evolving their consciousness, are sometimes discouraged by the state of things. But I think what you have said points out that the most important thing you can be doing is evolving yourself, is learning yourself and growing yourself. And if you happen to help somebody along the way with information such as we're doing today, that's just a good thing. You're putting it out as carefully as possible. You've done your logical derivations of hard science to show that this is an informational reality. So, that being said, the best thing that people can do, I think, for the collective consciousness is to improve themselves. Would you think that was
Yes, absolutely.
correct?
That's absolutely the case. You need to, the one thing you can do to help the whole, if what you want to do is help the world be a better place, the way to do that is to make yourself a better person. And what did Gandhi say? You want to be the change that you want to see. You have to be it first. Mm. That's the same idea.
That is.
Going out to change the world is generally counterproductive. The world has to change from the inside out, just like you do. You can't go out and force change, because then basically what you're saying is, I know the way people should be. I know the way how things should be, and boy, if I was just in charge, I'd just make all these changes and force it to be this way, and then we'd all live happily ever after. Probably not. You'd probably find that we didn't live happily ever after, that forcing your vision and your ideas, even if they're good ideas, upon other people, is not the solution. It's not going out and fixing the world. Start by fixing yourself. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't participate in a multiplayer game, that you don't get interested in politics, that you don't, place your votes very carefully and that sort of thing. It's not that it's all about me and nothing else matters, but your main function here isn't to fix anybody else. It's to fix yourself. Let go of that ego and let go of that fear. Open your mind. See a bigger picture. Understand what's going on. Understand your purpose of your life and the point of your existence. Those are the ways that you can grow yourself. And that's the point. Now, if you do that, then you will be helping other people do that as well, because they will see suddenly that your life works better and that you have a certain energy and personal power that is attractive. You're calm, you enjoy life, you find joy in things, and you start to become a good example. So that's how you help others, is by good example. And like we're doing, you can offer some information, but other people have to step up, internalize that information, get it at the being level rather than at the intellectual level. Otherwise, it doesn't do them any good. It's not about understanding at the intellectual level. If we often trick ourselves by understanding things at the intellectual level, and now we think we know it. Okay, we're smart, we know it. Unless you can integrate what you know at the intellectual level into your being level, actually, unless you eventually can bring those two to be the same thing, so that your being level is your intellectual level, so that your mind works right out of the state of your being rather than from a state of fear and ego. Unless you can change at the being level, then the change is very superficial. So a lot of people who hear this, if they intellectually grasp it, well, that's like step one. And then they have to grasp it at a deeper level. They have to really understand it. And the only way to do that is to experience it. Learn how to clear your mind. Learn how to focus. Learn how to access the databases. Practice, experiment until you can build confidence that what you're doing is real rather than just a part of your imagination. So you have to work at it, and you have to work at it over years and years. It's not something that you do casually. You live in an intellectual world casually, but in the being world, you evolve one step at a time, kind of slowly.
Well, speaking of intellectuals, one of your heroes, Einstein, had a particular interest in music. And I think to extend the My Big Toe to include musicians, to include music, how does that fit in? Einstein loved Mozart. Here's a person, highly intellectual, but when he played Mozart, he felt that there was some sort of connection on a higher level. If this may be the connection to consciousness that he was looking for, this happened accidentally, but that brought something rich to his life. I have talked to people who are musicians that claim it's a language, it's a way to communicate that's universal. It means a lot to them, and it certainly enriched Einstein's life. Have you read anything about that, or can you comment on that?
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit, and let's throw art in there with music.
All right.
And we'll talk about them both. Well, music is an art. So we'll talk about art in general then. There's a couple of ways and a couple of reasons why we are affected by art. By visual arts, by acoustic arts, music. One of the fundamental reasons, is that we as information, right? That's what defines us. We're in an information reality. This is a virtual reality. Well, how is a virtual reality made? What's the information? Where does the information come from? How do you build up information? Well, we call it a digital virtual reality. Again, go watch the videos to find out, where that comes from. We're just kind of assuming that now, that it's a digital virtual reality, rather than deriving it on the YouTube Calgary videos. Information is pattern. Information is process. Information is sequence. You see, well, what is pattern, process, and sequence? Music, right? What is pattern, process, and sequence? Art. It's the visual arts, you might say, are pattern. By pattern, I just mean constructing something visually that has content, that means something, right? That's the pattern. I might give you the opposite of pattern is randomness. If there's no pattern, then you have just randomness. There's no information. So as things coalesce into some sort of pattern or structure, so when I mean pattern, I don't necessarily mean plaid or stripes. When I mean pattern, I mean it's, structured bits, structured information such that it takes on content. It means something. Well, that's what an artist does. An artist, starts with pointillism, right? Or that's what a graphic artist, say, on a computer does. It's patterns of little dots, right? Pixels. And all those little pixels, have certain information, like a pointillist, put just lots of little dots of paint. But it's patterns of things. And in a computer, all those little dots and pixels are what? Ones and zeros. So they're patterns of ones and zeros. So however you define patterns, you have these patterns are information. So our reality is made up of patterns, process, and sequence. That patterns of patterns. Patterns can depend on other patterns. Given this pattern, then you can evolve that to a different pattern based on first pattern. Information flows, grows, it evolves. And this is the evolution of process. The process is called evolution. Evolution is the process, okay? And consciousness, is the media. And information is the content that makes up our reality. So why do we respond to art and music? It's us. You see, we relate to that in a very personal, deep, and fundamental way. We, in this reality, our whole reality, our consciousness, our universe, our world, whatever we say, our entire reality frame is process, pattern, and sequence. Sequences of patterns, like sequences of notes or sequences of brushstrokes. You see, it's all, so we relate to that in a very fundamental way. So we look at the way somebody throws paint on a canvas. Now, there are artists who, by the time they're done, it looks like a photograph. And then there are photographers, who fuzz up their pictures in Photoshop and makes it look like an artist. All of these are doing similar things. It's all just information, as are we, and we relate to it. So those squiggles, I once saw where a guy had this, I think it was like, I don't know, he had a chimpanzee or a monkey of some sort that he gave paint who splattered and threw things. And yeah. I've seen that on the, on a monitor someplace, and doing quite well, selling the art. Well, people might say, well, that's not art. There was somebody else who had like balloons full of paint, and they shot them or did something to them to bust them, and it threw the paint around, and that was art. Well, that is art. Art doesn't have to be hard to do as far as the technique goes. What art has to do is speak to people on an emotional level. So if you look at that canvas and it's just all these swirls and lines and stuff, and it doesn't really look like anything, but you like it just the same, it says something to you because you look at all that, those swirls going every way, and you say, yeah, that's my life. My life is like that. My life is just, swirling around, and here's a big red current going through there. I can kind of relate to that, that was such and such, but it's not that you one for one say, oh, that was my first job. When you look at that art, it just talks to you. You can see perhaps the turmoil, perhaps the balance, perhaps the uncertainty, or the endlessness of it, or whatever it is that appeals to you. You can see that in it. And that then you connect with that, because that visual pattern or that sonic pattern, that musical pattern, expresses something that is you. Some part of your experience, some part of your life is expressed by that. Okay, now, if you have somebody who makes very, let's say they paint with very stark, zigzag, sharp, everything's got sharp corners and so on, that's kind of the broken glass, sharpness approach, and that will appeal to somebody whose life is like that, somebody who lives in New York City, right, and leads a staccato life of busy and noise and that sort of thing. And you look at art that's different than that, that's maybe more, flowy and soft and muted tones and that kind of stuff, and that'll appeal to a different person. So we all get out of it. And the music, well, if a musician is connected to the larger reality, if that musician is using their mind, and it's not necessarily getting data from the database, but just seeing the big picture, not just this little picture of what's going on in their daily life, but they get a bigger picture, a better feel for things. They start to connect with the larger consciousness system. That then can inspire. They can get the kind of the music that suits that feeling, that connection. And when they take that and put it then to individual notes, to sequence and process and make music, other people listen to it, and it's relaxing. And it gives them a sense of a bigger picture. It gives them a sense of order and beauty that's non-definable. You see, so how the artist approaches their work has a lot to do with what you get out of it. So here's Albert Einstein listening to Mozart, and Mozart's a very airy, kind of beautiful, I don't know what you'd want to say, in the clouds. It's not bang, 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 or it's not the jackhammer thing. It's usually very sweet, and it's kind of a relaxing sort of music. And then you have the New Age musicians, right? Like the Halperins and those who, the bamboo flute and the gongs and whatever, and they try to produce this same thing in the same way. Well, they're just doing it with a different structure. Mozart did it with an orchestra. They're doing it with different kinds of sounds. A lot of them are electronic, perhaps, and created sounds. And it's the same thing, though. It's all art. And the point isn't how easy or hard was it to do, how many years of education did it take to be able to do it. The point is, how does it affect you? What do you get out of it? What does it say to you? Can you relate to it in a fundamental and personal way? And if you can, then that's good art for you. But we all don't relate to the same things. We all have different things that kind of touch us in that way. So art, in a way, is capturing us in a picture or a sound that we can relate to personally, not intellectually, but just at the being level. We connect with it at the being level. Now, people who try to connect with it at an intellectual level generally never get it. They're the ones who look at it and say, oh, I think I see a little bird in there, that sort of thing. Instead of just taking the whole thing and connecting with it, they're trying to intellectualize what the various pieces are, because to them it's not art if it doesn't have things in it that you can recognize. So it's a different approach. But you can get answers, you can get music, you can get solutions to problems, you can get, you can find your programming errors, you can get that scientific solution. You can solve that engineering problem. All these things are more available to you when you can open up to a larger space, to a larger view of things. Because in that larger view, and you're open to information, you can get information that kind of ties things together, because you can see things in a bigger picture, not with your intellect. This is outside your intellect for the most part. You get it in a sense of knowing.
So you're speaking of an altered state.
Yeah, it's an altered state, yes. And you may get in that altered state by listening to Mozart.
Yeah.
You see, that may help you because Mozart was kind of in an altered state when he got the music, you see. So his music may help put you in that state. Or something else might, your meditation or a mandala or just whatever, just sitting in a quiet place. But you can get this information that's very useful to you in your personal life, with your relationships, with your careers. If you can live in the larger reality, if you can even visit the larger reality, open yourself up to that, see the bigger picture, often things will make sense to you that just don't make sense if you're sitting here with your intellect grinding away at them, detail for detail for detail, because that's not where the solution is. The solution isn't in grinding these details that you know. The solution is backing off, getting a different paradigm, a bigger picture, looking from a larger view. Then suddenly all that stuff you're looking at in the detail kind of makes sense when it fits into the context of that bigger picture. And then when you get your aha moments, where you see that something fits. Aha, I see it. I see how that's connected now. Whereas as long as you stay intellectually engaged in the details, you can't see that big picture because your focus now is focused on this gear and that lever and this thing and all these pieces. And it's the same with an artist. Most artists who are really good don't paint by the numbers. They're not saying, oh, a little dab of red here, a little dab of blue there. It's not like they're painting by the numbers. You can paint by the numbers and make a very pretty picture, but the picture lacks feeling. The picture lacks whatever it is that makes good art. It's just a very pretty picture. It looks like it was done by somebody that really knew what color to put in what place. And, a 12-year-old can buy a paints by the number thing and produce a painting that's way beyond their ability to just draw on their own. It makes you look like you're a good artist when you're not, because you can produce something that looks pretty good, paint by the numbers. But that's not what it's about, you see. It's not about using the intellect to do the details. We get lost in that. We get consumed by it. And we get frustrated with it. When most of the time, if you want to have a better relationship with your significant other, it isn't really about the details. It's about seeing the bigger picture. It's about seeing the context. Why is your significant other feeling the way they feel? From their viewpoint. Not how ridiculous their feeling is from your viewpoint, you see. That's you grinding away at the details. Won't get you anywhere. You got to get a bigger picture than that. Get out of just your own thing. So you have to see where their viewpoint is and why they feel that way. And then you have to realize it doesn't matter where their viewpoint comes from. It's their viewpoint. And you need to deal with it in a profitable way, no matter where it comes from. The fact that you think it's a ridiculous viewpoint is beside the point. It's important to them. And if they are important to you, then you deal with it. But see, you only see that from a bigger picture. As long as you're wrapped up in your own ego, then they're foolish and they just need to change. You see, that's the little picture view. That's you being foolish and you need to change. You see, when you think other people are foolish and need to change, that's a good sign that you're foolish and you need to change. So it all works the same way, whether it's art, whether it's improving your marriage or your life with your girlfriend or with your boss, or with your parents or with your wife's parents or whatever, it doesn't matter. The bigger picture gives you, and it's not so much information like we think of somebody talking to us and telling us what the secret is to really make that a good painting or a good song or a good sound, or what we should say to our significant other. Don't expect that kind of information. It's not that that you're dealing into Dear Abby and she's going to tell you, what to do. That's the wrong approach. That's the intellect now looking for a prescription about what to do. The problem isn't at the doing level. The problem's at the being level. And if you understand, or if you get to a point where you are being right, then the doing will just automatically work right. As far as the interaction, the plan, the music, whatever. The doing will come. How your hand moves to make the brush strokes, how you write down all those notes, and how you integrate the strings with the horns, and all the rest of that will just fall in. You have to do it at the being level. But if you start at the intellectual level and say, all right, I got a bunch of violinists, I got a bunch of horns, how am I going to make them do something? And it's all intellect. Well, you still might make something that's nice, just like you can paint with the numbers and make kind of a nice picture. But it won't have the art, it won't speak to people because it came out of here, didn't come out of here. You need the bigger picture with things. So it doesn't matter what your profession is, whether you're a counselor, whether you're a cook. Cooks are creative, right? Whether you're a cook, whether you're a homemaker, whether what you do is clean houses, makes no difference what you do. Whether you're a student, you can improve your life, you can improve your relationships, you can do better at whatever your job is if you're a whole person, not just a little left brain intellect, constantly spinning its wheels, running around in a little cage like those hamsters do, just running as fast as you can and never getting anywhere. That's the thing. So to grow up and live in the bigger picture, to see reality from a bigger viewpoint, so you understand why he or she says, feels, acts like that, rather than just saying, well, how do I feel about what they're doing? It's about me. You see, you can get that. Mozart can kind of get that pattern, that feeling. And then he's just expressing that in his notes. So his skill is that he can take that he hears, that he feels from that bigger picture, and he can translate that
in a sequence.
He can put that into pattern and sequence. Okay, but he gets it in one big chunk, one big picture. Whomp, that's it. He experiences it. He doesn't have somebody tell him, now put a note on this line, now put a note on that line. It's not coming through his intellect. He gets the experience. And then he can translate, because he's skilled at music, he can translate that experience into pattern and sequence and sound. And then when we listen, we get his experience, or our own interpretation of his experience, you see. And we say, wow, he was a genius. Whereas somebody else who just maybe works hard, but tries to do it out of their intellect, we say, well, they're pretty good on that piano or whatever, but the genius doesn't seem to be there, unless to you genius is how fast can they play. Then it's just all mechanical skill. And some people can wow you with their skills, but it's still not the same as something that grabs you at an emotional, deeper level.
I think all of this speaks in support of a subjective reality.
Oh, sure. Absolutely.
Because otherwise, if it was objective, and Mozart's music is an example of a high art, everyone would love Mozart. So it's very...
And also you'd be able to take a computer and say, okay, computer, analyze Mozart. You see his style, you see how he uses his notes, you see how he changes things. All right, now write me something else in the same style. Well, they have done that with computers. And the computer will write it, and everybody listens to it and says, yeah, that's kind of nice. But nobody goes, oh, wow. Let me put the earphones on, that's really something. It's the same with painting. Computers can make some lovely art. We talk about the fractal art. You can make some beautiful art with computers. But it's generally doesn't get people, because what it is now they've taken somebody else's creative process and they've automated it. And it's okay, it's nice, but it generally doesn't have that, so it's not like, oh, such and such, this mainframe is a great artist, has exhibits all over the world in the best, museums and art galleries. It doesn't work like that, because it's neat. And it may be precise, and the technique may be immaculate because it's down at the at the pixel level of detail, but
it's coming from here. It's not coming from the other that you always speak about.
Yeah. So
tapping into
it's not the same thing. So there's another dimension, you see, to our reality. It's not just this objective reality where we do objective things. You see, that's why music and art are kind of interesting. I shouldn't say it's why they're interesting, but it's why in this discussion of reality they hold kind of a very interesting place, And that's because music and art obviously are not objective. Nobody pretends that they are objective. Everybody says, no, that's obviously a subjective thing. And yet music and art touch us at a very deep place, not an irrelevant place. So if we live in this objective reality where the subjective is irrelevant, because the only thing that's relevant is this objective stuff and what you can plan, what you can count on, and it has to be logical, then we see that as kind of cold, hard, heartless facts. Nobody gets too excited about that, right? I mean, you need that, right? I mean, you need to know how to operate your car. That's objective, You can't just do anything or it won't work. But there's another component to us that is much more significant than all that objective stuff. Significant to us personally as individuals. And music and art are, two expressions of that. But we can take that same source, that is the source of great music and great art, and make that a source of great living for us individually. Affects our jobs, our relationships, what we do, our life, and then your life becomes a work of art. You see, your life becomes really a work of art because you're living it out of the being level. And if you live it out of the being level instead of that intellectual level, then your life is a work of art. And it is joy. And it is peace. And you do influence others because just of the way you are. As long as you're living your life out of your intellect and out of your ego, you're just like that artist who's painting by the numbers. It gets you by, but it isn't really important. It isn't really significant. It's not it's just there. It's going through the motions. It's shallow. So it's the same with your life. Make your life a piece of art. And the way you do that is like any art. You have to see a bigger picture and you have to express that bigger picture in all your intents. And then you let the doing, the brushstroke, the how you transcribe the notes, you let all the doing of it just flow as an expression of the being level. Then you're a real, genuine conscious being expressing itself at the being level, and your life is an art, and other people will see you as art. You are just like art is to people. They relate to it. They get something from it. You become that to other people. They see you and they see your life, and they feel something different. They appreciate. They get something out of it. So you start to become a good example as well. But you then are the same thing to other people as art is. They're seeing a life that's an art form. And it's all about being, growing up and being at the being level. It's all about love. It's all about caring. It's all about other. And once you learn these things and learn how to live in a larger reality, then it just changes your entire existence. It's a metaphor I hadn't thought of before, but your life becomes a work of art. That's kind of a neat metaphor, isn't
nice.
it? But it does work that way. And so yes, any profession. And it doesn't have to be a profession. Profession tends to be something that you get paid for, right? And it's not necessarily that. Just your life in general, your hobby is your relationships, just everything that you do.
On YouTube, you have some of your comments on what happens after we die, the afterlife. This from the Path 11 production of the Path, the Afterlife. Some comments from you have generated a lot of questions. How does this man know about the afterlife? How does he know what happens after we die? There's been several comments on YouTube, and particularly John Shelby Spong, who is a retired Protestant bishop, has stated hell is an invention of the church to control people with fear. I think your comments on the afterlife are because people are very fearful of what happens when they die. They have certain beliefs, and I was wondering if you could elaborate and explain why it is you do know some of the particulars of what happens
Okay,
when
sure.
we die.
Sure, that's a good question. First of all, let's just say it more accurately. And as we say it more accurately, what happens after you die, right? We say that more accurately, it solves a lot of the problems, just in saying it correctly. And by that I mean, you don't die. There is no death. Okay? You are a virtual character, if you will, avatar, however you want to express that. You're a virtual being in its virtual reality. That's your physical being I'm talking about. Okay, your consciousness is fundamental, but your body here in this virtual reality is a virtual body. It doesn't die any more than your elf man dies in World of Warcraft when a tree falls on him. You know, it's no different than that. Okay, so you don't die. What you do is that you leave this virtual reality. Okay. So you are consciousness. You are we say experiencing the virtual reality. You know, it'd take me a while to go in and explain all that. How is it that you experience it and so on? But you're experiencing this virtual reality, and your character grows old and dies, or gets run over by a truck and dies. Well, that character doesn't die. That character just becomes aware in a different reality system, if it's consciousness. Now, in World of Warcraft, at least in the old one, you used to wake up in a graveyard. You know, you'd pop out in a graveyard, and then you'd have to run all the way back to wherever it is you were last in the game. You know, that's how it handles death. Because obviously, if you paid your $10 a month, you don't want your character to die. Now you're done, right? Got to go pay them. You know, again, you start another whole game. It's not like that. Your character dies a lot in those games because that's the challenge. You know, if you can beat the monsters. A lot of times the monsters beat you before you learn how to beat them, and so you have to be able to be reincarnated a whole lot. Otherwise, the game would become very frustrating. So that's the same as it is. That works a similar way here. Now, we don't pop up in a graveyard like they do there. That's a metaphor that they use in the World of Warcraft. And maybe they don't even use that now. My World of Warcraft knowledge goes back to when my son was a teenager, which is a long time ago. He's in his middle 20s now. So, in any case, so we don't die. What we do is we make a transition. We're no longer a virtual character in that virtual reality. Okay. But what are we? Well, we're consciousness. Now, as consciousness, what is it that we're doing? What's our point? What's our purpose? What are we about? You say, what's that character about in World of Warcraft? Well, that character in World of Warcraft is about fighting the boss monster and winning, because that's how you collect points. Okay, so what he does is he jumps up out of the graveyard and has to run back and get back in the fight again, because that's what he's about, is winning that battle. Well, that's not what we're about. We're about evolving the quality of our consciousness. We're about growing up. We're about helping the larger consciousness system evolve the quality of its consciousness, because we are a part of it. So what do when our character dies here? Well, we start the process of starting a new character. Now, in World of Warcraft, you just resurrect your old character, because that's convenient. We don't resurrect our old character. We start a new character. And each character each character that comes and plays, we call it a lifetime, or an experience packet. You come into the reality and you have experiences, and then you leave it by dying, quote unquote, in this virtual reality. And then because what you do is grow your consciousness, grow your quality and evolve, what you do then is plan to get back in the game, because that's how you raise your consciousness. So everything that happens from then on is really focused on getting back in the game, because that's your point. All right, so what really does happen? Well, as soon as you let your character go here, you become aware that you still exist in another reality frame. Okay, so here you are existing in another reality frame. That can be, depending on your beliefs, that can be upsetting, that can be scary. That can be high drama, or it could be old hat. Depends on what your belief systems are. Okay, if you're particularly religious in a religion that has a heaven and hell sort of thing, then your immediate reaction is probably fear. Where am I? Where am I going? What's the process? Am I in heaven? Am I in hell? Or hasn't that decision been made yet? Am I at the pearly gates? Going to get my ticket one way or the other? So then you have all this anxiety. So you start with a lot of anxiety. Or it's like waking up in a place that you've never been before. And let's say that you go to bed tonight in your normal bed, in your normal house, in your normal community, and you wake up the next morning and you're with those pygmies in the Amazon jungle, or you're in a little house somewhere in rural China. Does that cause you any anxiety? And suddenly you wake up and your surroundings are completely different. Yeah, it's going to cause you a little anxiety, right? Well, people who then wake up after their character goes away in the virtual reality, sometimes they have a little anxiety because they don't know what's going on. Where am I? What's going on here? Okay. Other times they know that they have dropped that character. They're in a kind of a non-physical being, and they think, oh, okay, this is what it's like when you die. Gee, I'd like to see my Uncle Frank and and Aunt Harriet and whatever, Grandpa, who've all been dead for decades. Now, because that's where dead people live, right? I'm dead, here I am, so this must be the place where all the dead people live. Well, it's not like that either. See, all the dead people just don't hang around to greet their relatives. That's not what they're about. They're about growing their reality. So they're on their process back to increasing the quality of their consciousness, and that's what the purpose is of this virtual reality game. That's why we're in it. So those people then who, whatever their belief system is, often have anxiety, often have expectations, like meeting Uncle Fred. So that reality is designed to deal with those expectations, with those fears, with that anxiety. And it's basically a reality frame where you are pacified, calm down, relax, everything's going to be all right, and basically a place where you can waste a little time while the dream that you just had, that is that old physical reality that you just exited when you, quote, died, unquote, from it, that starts to disappear. Just like a dream disappears. You wake up and immediately it's real clear. 2 or 3 minutes later, it's real fuzzy. 10 minutes later, you don't remember what it was about. That's the way dreams often are. That's the way this life is. After you pass out of this reality frame, it decays like a dream. So in the meantime, you have to deal with some anxiety. You have to deal with, well, what do I do next? And where's my Uncle Fred? And you deal with all of that while the dream is dying. Because in just a little while, you don't remember you had an Uncle Fred. So that's going to just kind of go away. But there's a short time there where this reality frame has to deal with that. And they do. They deal with that, but it's more of a pacification, relax, everything's okay, you're doing fine, no problem. No, you're not going to go to hell, you're not going to be burnt, we're not going to do any of these things to you. Come on over here and here's the line for matriculating in. Just get in this line and talk to the Guyper and he'll tell you everything you need to know. Well, all that is basically buying time for this dream to. It's not that guy's really going to tell you everything you need to know. It's by the time you get up that far in the line, you don't care anymore. You've forgotten all of that. You're not in the same state of need and anxiety that you were, because it's a very peaceful place. Nobody's shouting, nobody's yelling, there's no violence going on. It's a nice, quiet, peaceful place. So depending on your needs, various things happen. Now, if you come out of this and you say, okay, I'm in a transition, I'd like to go prepare for the next, well, then you're on the fast track, right? You pass all that stuff. Nobody tells you to go get in line because you don't need that. Nobody tells you, we're going to have a class and we're going to tell you what to do next. And so you don't need all that transition hand-holding. You just go right through the process. If you come in with lots of fear and lots of expectations, you're going to need a lot more hand-holding process. So that's the reality that you have, and there are beings that work in that reality, interact with you, that are basically hand-holding, helping you deal with the process, and some of it are just computer characters, if you will, that are in that reality frame. All right, so that's kind of what happens. Next, once you get to the point where you're bored with nothing much happening here, really, what's going on? I've just been hanging around here, and it seems like other people come and go, but I'm still here. You'll get bored with it and want to do something else, and then you'll kind of get engaged in the process of reviewing your old life. What are your weak points, your strong points? What do you need to learn? How is it that you can best improve the quality of your consciousness, grow up, increase, lower your entropy, all the things that if you read my books or if you go look at the Calgary video, you'll find out what I'm talking about. What is this with the quality of consciousness and so on. You'll find that all defined and derived there. But in any case, you start getting more into planning for that. You review this life to see what situation would give you the best opportunities to grow and develop in a way you need to evolve. Okay, then once you kind of understand that, a situation will be picked for you that kind of meets your criteria, and there you go. Next thing you know, somebody's slapping your bottom, and you're crying, and you're back in this, but at this point you don't remember any of it. You're just an infant in this large reality. Now at that point, as an infant, as a newborn babe, or even while you're still in utero, you will have some awareness of that larger reality system. You're kind of in both places. You're kind of in the physical and in the non-physical reality frame. So you're in this virtual reality as a fetus, or you're in this virtual reality as a newborn, but you're also as a component of you that's still in that larger reality that still kind of has that bigger picture. As you develop and take on more of the understanding of how to interpret this virtual reality, you let go of that connection with the larger reality slowly. So eventually, by the time you're 7 years old or so, you've kind of lost your connection with the larger reality. You lost your invisible playmates. You've kind of lost your sense of magic, and what's going on. Everything gets more objective and logical, and you go that way. So that's kind of the process you go through. Now, how do I know that? Okay, how would I know that that's the way it works, and that's why it works? And I've described this other places. So you can find more detail other videos. Several ways. Actually, I can think of 3 separate avenues of information that causes me to tell you that this is the way it is. One of them is that, well, let's kind of do them in reverse order. One of them is that I've worked there. I've had an opportunity to spend some time working in that virtual reality where people who have newly died in the virtual reality, if you will, or are in the process of being become awake again in the larger reality, in this virtual reality. What's the right word? They say you've passed over. You've what all those words are, transitioned. So the people transitioning, I've had a job in that reality where I've interacted with those people, particularly ones that were having difficulty. And that's not really a hard job to get. If you become able to get around in that reality, you can work there, as part of what you do. Sometimes they call it, some parts of it they call it retrieval process, where you help those that are having trouble making the transition. But in general, you can just kind of hang out there and see what's going on and how it's being done. You can spend a little time there, so you can watch it as an observer take place. Okay. Another way is, and as a participant actually in dealing with people. Another way is that I have been with people who were in the process of dying, of transforming out of this virtual reality into the next virtual reality. And you can watch the process. You can be with them, and when I'm with them, It doesn't necessarily mean I'm physically sitting with them, although I've done that before too. But you are with them in the physical. You can watch them die. You can watch because you're in touch really with their consciousness, or if you're religious, you might say with their spirit. So you're kind of watching them there. You can watch it kind of, the body die, the spirit moves on. This is all metaphor, moves on. It's a metaphor. It sounds like distance, right? It sounds like you're going from point A to point B. You're getting up out of the body and you're walking across the room. All that's metaphor. But you can see this transition, and then you can follow that transition to the point where they're greeted, their anxiety is dealt with, and so on. So you can follow the process that way, where you start with a person who is still physically alive here and just follow their process through by connecting with their consciousness and following the consciousness. And the third avenue is that it fits the theory. That concept of how that works fits the theory. And you can say, yeah, well, the theory's wrong, right? And well, you could just have imagined those other things. Well, okay, those are valid things. All right, I just imagined that I was working there, and I just imagined that I was with those people, and the theory's wrong. But here's the kind of the rub on that, and why you might think that that's not the case. The theory explains science. It's not only a metaphysical theory that explains airy metaphysical things with no evidence. It explains physics. It explains the nature of reality. It solves a whole bunch of problems that pair labs. It solves the problems of Dr. Emoto. It solves the problems of Bill Tiller, does the water. And it solves a lot of physics problems. It solves the problems of the paranormal and precognitive dreams, which many people have had. Telepathic communication, which happens often enough. With remote viewing, with placebo effect, with mental healing. All of those things which have been documented as real things, it explains all of those things. And if you don't happen to believe none of that, that any of that's ever been documented, then you've just lived in a very sheltered world with a belief in objective reality. You haven't gotten out much. There's lots and lots of books that you can read where bona fide good experiments with trained scientists and immaculate protocols have demonstrated these things are real over and over and over again for the last 200 years. So it's not, that's not the question. So it explains all that stuff, as well as explaining how the double slit experiment works, what's fundamental to quantum mechanics, how that quantum mechanics reality, well, it's not just double slit, but how that quantum mechanics reality applies to the larger reality, how it is, how synchronicity works and happens. So it explains a lot of physical things that are now unexplainable. It's all those weird things in physics that nobody can explain. How is it that the universe is accelerating? Its size is accelerating, it's expanding, and it's expanding in an accelerated way. So it keeps expanding more and more and more per unit of time. Okay, how is that possible? What is it expanding into? What's out there that it's expanding into? See, those are all logical blocks that science can't answer. Big Bang. What was before the Big Bang? Where did the Big Bang come from? Our universe didn't exist. And where did that little tight ball of energy come from? What held it tight like that until it started to expand? Where did all that come from? Well, it couldn't have come from our universe. It couldn't have come from a physical universe because that physical universe didn't exist yet. It can't create itself. It had to, there has to be a prior cause that created that. Well, there is, and this explains all of that. Where's the Big Bang come? How is it that entangled pairs, you flip one spin, the other spin flips on the other side of the universe instantly? How does that work? Why is it like that? Well, this theory explains all that. So it's good science. If you've got a theory that's good science, and it explains metaphysics, what did the Buddha mean when he said compassion is the key, and that all of this material world it's not there, it's an illusion. Yeah, that was his word. That this physical reality is just an illusion. Well, now you can understand the context of that. What did he mean when he said that? What is it that God is love? What does that mean? And you start seeing the continuity of metaphysical beliefs. And what's good is that you can start separating the wheat from the chaff there. You can see that, well, here in this metaphysical stuff, that's silly. That doesn't, theory doesn't support that. And here's the part that makes sense. And what is it that's silly and doesn't support? Well, it's all the dogma. And all of that stuff kind of falls out as unnecessary. And the very fundamental nature of consciousness and of being and of our reality, which is a thread that flows through from ancient times right up through present times. And you see that thread is in all the major metaphysical, religious, if you will, concepts. We have all these common threads. So the common threads then suddenly make sense. So you've explained all of this. So if you have a theory that works, that explains all the data, and so far it does explain all the data. It explains why physics is the way it is. It explains that this physical reality is just an approximation of an objective reality, and how that works, how it fits into the larger reality. So, what's the relationship between brains and consciousness? Explains all of those things. What is consciousness? So if you can have a theory that explains science, explains metaphysics, and hasn't yet found something that's fundamental, that it doesn't explain, then when it explains this other thing, then it has some credibility. You see, that's the other reason. It's because it has credibility. It fits with the way we know reality works, because we can explain everything, particularly science, with this idea. So then when it also explains this, then there's some credibility there. And because I've practiced a long time and have exercised my consciousness and learned how to have these experiences, we talked about databases, learn how to get data out of the data, learn how to do this stuff, and I've done it enough that I've checked it with physical things. You validate it, and that then gives, to me anyway, my experience comes from a lot of research and a lot of validating with things that I could objectively say. And then here I have this experience, then I tend to trust that experience because of my background and the time I've put into being able to trust it by doing a lot of experimentation with it. So that's why I'd say, where do I get it from? I get it from those three things. I've actually worked there to where I've seen lots of the newcomers coming in, and I've seen how they've been processed. I've followed the process through from the other side, starting with the live body here in the virtual reality and following it through to that process. And then it fits with the theory. It's a rational part of the explanation of everything. So that's basically what it comes down to. I don't want anybody to believe it.
Right.
Don't believe it, please. Don't believe anything I say. Don't disbelieve anything I say. You need to find out for yourself. But I think it's credible.
Well, I think you've answered that question for those who had the question of how do you know this? How do you know what happens after you die? You've also done a lot of documentation with the Monroe Institute, with Bob Monroe. They have a program now that even delves into soul retrieval, I think it is, and that kind of thing. So there's more information there. Also, if people understand that this is a virtual reality, if they eventually get to that point, I think this is a very easy step up to take to understanding how all of this is possible. Mm-hmm. I think that's an important thing. So if they really want to know more, they need to read your My Big Toe and understand that this is a virtual reality. And that might involve for some letting go of a lot of very rigid beliefs. But I believe that this is the best big picture information available. And I just, on my own beginner's level, have to say that I can corroborate your statements from my own experience, because in small ways. I've done a little bit of soul retrieval. And you don't necessarily, even if you're open to this, you don't necessarily even have to set your intent to help someone. Sometimes they just come to you.
Mm-hmm.
And I've had that happen a lot. I'd like to do more of that.
That's because you're ready for the experience. The experience now is something that you can learn from. It will be useful to you. It's an opportunity. If you're not ready for the experience, then there's no point. So once you're ready for the experience, this system wants us to succeed in our evolution. So here you are, ready for an experience that will help you, would be an opportunity. So the experience comes to you. You don't even have to go out and search for it. The system is very proactive in helping us grow up.
It's fascinating. It's very humbling, and it's very eye-opening. So when I ask you these questions and I hear your answers, it makes a lot of sense to me. And I hope that more people who are seriously interested in this will, for their own reasons, for whatever aspect of reality they would like to, delve into, I hope they can do that by reading You're My Big Toe, because I know that is the best information out there.
Yeah, well, we've just kind of wandered around in some subject areas that will probably make great sense to those people who are ready to deal with the information, will probably sound like nonsense to those who are not ready, don't have the background, don't have the basic concepts in place to understand what's going on. And for most of those, if they do read the My Big Toe, and it's for free, you go to Google Books and read it for free. This is not a book-selling operation primarily. We do sell books, but it's free. And all the things, most of my workshops, they're all free on YouTube. So if you go and learn something, it'll give you a whole different perspective of what it is that I'm saying now. So a lot of this just kind of assumed that you had that knowledge. If you don't have that knowledge, then it may not make a lot of sense to you, and it may seem kind of silly and nothing to support it. But I can't start every time I talk from the beginning and do an 8-hour lecture to bring you up to speed scientifically and logically to understand the things I say. So we've gotten to the point now that the listener, the reader, if you will, needs to go do the homework themselves so that they can make sense out of this. And if they're not ready for that, then they won't do it. It won't be interesting to them, and they'll say,
That's right.
And they'll go away. But that's fine. That's where they are.
There's many people out there, and a lot of them are connected with the Monroe Institute, and they've written books, and there's a lot of people out there with the same experiences on their own individual levels of this kind of thing. So it's not, I think you are unique in that your experience is very extensive, but there are many people out there who have experienced these kind of so-called paranormal things, and we need to, I read Bob Monroe's books when it first came out, his first book, Journeys Out of the Body, and that was back in the 70s. I never found an answer. I found many interesting books and speakers who gave bits of information over those 30 or nearly 40 years now. And no one had a cohesive, logically derived, scientific viewpoint of how and why all of these things work and how they are. So I think that's the importance of your work. So we have to stress that all of these things you're talking about that are so-called paranormal things are based in science, and I'm looking forward to that day when that is accepted.
That will be a good day.
Yeah.